Our weight in the Western world has been heading upwards for decades, along with the number of calories that we eat, which has risen by approximately 25% since 1961, from 2,881 to 3,600 calories per day. Yes, we're eating much more than we did 50 plus years ago. Why? Well, part of that reason is we're being conned into doing so. Yes, indeed, conned. Foods high in fat, salt and sugars were available well before the 1960s. They're not new inventions, yet our parents and grandparents didn't stuff themselves the way people do now. If you want to know more, then keep listening to the end of the video, as I'm going to tell you the whole sad story about how we've been conned and are being conned by the food industry as it's evolved over the last 50 plus years. Hi, I'm Diane from Trilogy Life Coaching. My vision is to help people create new health and wellness habits so they can create a life they fully love. So sit tight as we take a deep dive into how the food industry has made us addicted to food. It's become a well-known fact that we're eating our way to cancer. That can't be denied. In October 2017, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the USA came out with a major report that linked 13 types of cancer to excess weight. And 4 out of every 10 diagnosed cancer cases were shown to be attributed to being overweight or obese. Now, this wasn't new information. It's been known for a long time that excess weight is a leading cause of cancer, but this study put more precise numbers to the problem. So here are some questions that we need to ask ourselves. Is there something new in most foods consumed today that was not available in the past? And if there is, the second question is, could this be the missing piece in the obesity puzzle? If there is something new and different about food that's making us eat more and become obese, then it might be useful for us to know about it. We know there are compounds being added liberally to today's diet of processed foods. These additives don't contain any calories in themselves, but they make food tasty and desirable. And we probably wouldn't eat some of those foods if these ingredients weren't actually there. And they're called flavourings. Mark Schatzker has written a book called The Dorito Effect. It's a great read if you're interested, and I suggest you get yourself a copy. I've put the links in the show notes below. He suggests that we won't find the cause of obesity in individual ingredients like sugar, carbohydrates and saturated fat alone, no matter how much we enjoy those foods that contain them. And he also says genes alone can't explain our expanding waistlines over the last half a century, because they couldn't have changed so much in such a short space of time. And he identifies flavourings as the missing link in the obesity cancer epidemic, because their effects extend well beyond just taste alone. Mr. Schatzker describes flavourings as emotion expressed in the medium of food, because food companies fully understand the science and psychology of food. They have worked out how to use flavourings to give us a heightened sense of pleasure or to cause us to experience particular feelings. For instance, food technologists know that flavours are created to fit our need state. And if creating a new food product for a health spa, it would be flavoured to give a sense of wholeness and wellness, and it would need to induce feelings of calm and tranquility. But a new food product for a sports bar, for example, a protein bar, would have to induce feelings of action and adventure. Flavour technology can be used to manipulate areas of the mind that experience our feelings, and the consequence of playing with our emotions is that most of us are overeating. Some foods act on neurotransmitters like pleasure-inducing dopamine, whilst others can stimulate the orbitofrontal cortex, which is involved with our decision-making processes. And this makes us more likely to say yes to another cookie and another and another. Go on, you know that you do. Food can also act on the insula, a brain region involved with emotion and cravings. In brain scans, the insula lights up when people crave drugs. And lab rats develop binging and addictive patterns of behaviour when fed highly processed foods like Oreo double-stuffed chocolate cookies. But this doesn't happen when they eat their normal rat food. And many scientists are now taking the view that food can be addictive in much the same way as alcohol, cocaine, and many other drugs. So this type of compulsive behaviour is one of the hallmarks, of course, of addiction. And the most addictive foods are highly processed, they contain sugar, refined hard carbohydrates, fats, sweet fat combinations, and or high amounts of salt. And in a study conducted in 2015, researchers at the New York Obesity Research Center found that among 504 participants, the 6 foods rated the most addictive were, I don't think there are going to be any surprises here, chocolate, ice cream, French fries, pizza, cookies, and chips. And the least addictive food out of the 35 listed were beans, followed by broccoli, cucumber, water, brown rice, and carrots. So the top 10 addictive foods were highly processed, while the 13 that made up the bottom of the list were unprocessed and presented the fewest problems in terms of addictive behaviours. And the most addictive foods also have a high glycemic load, which raises your blood glucose and causes type 2 diabetes. The speed and intensity by which they raise your blood glucose causes these foods to act on the reward centres in the brain to directly affect cravings. The highly processed foods that cause addiction all contain flavourings, and if you think French fries don't contain flavourings, that may be true if you make them from raw potatoes at home, but not if you eat out. McDonald's French fries contain 19, yes, a whopping amount of artificial ingredients, 19 of them, added to the humble potato. Growing up, I would have helped my mother cut up the potatoes at home. She would have cooked them in oil and we would have added a little bit of salt at the table. Now, if you want to learn more about how to eat well and improve your health, then check out my playlist just here. So let's now take a look at how food is engineered to be addictive. Mr. Schatzker's most famous example is the one that became the title of his book, Doritos. And when this snack was first introduced in 1964, it was not successful, even though chips were made with carbs, fat, and salt. What turned this failing product into a food industry hit was the addition of flavours. Nowadays, in the Western world and increasingly in some parts of the developing world, eating is a behaviour driven by the expectation of pleasure, not usually because we're hungry. And pleasure comes from the flavour of food. We create flavours, Mr. Schatzker writes. Flavours are what make food seem like food. Since addiction is about craving and desire for the food addict, food never quite lives up to the expectation when eaten, and so a further and bigger hit is required, resulting in our calorie intake going up. Americans have become food junkies, according to Mr. Schatzker. 7% have a body mass index consistent with full addiction, and millions more are using more than they ought to. It looks an awful lot like food has become too pleasurable. Our food is no longer grown or bred for flavour, and that is part of the problem. To create chickens that become big really fast, the poultry industry started to focus on a high-energy diet and genetically altering livestock, which was done through breeding in those days rather than messing about with the DNA in the lab. Similar changes have been seen in other livestock, as well as in grains, fruits, and vegetables. But there's a price to pay when breeding or growing for size, yield, appearance, and shelf life. The resulting product has little or no flavour, and this is plainly seen in produce such as supermarket tomatoes and more, but it's equally true of many other types of food you'd never imagine. Food became bland, with chicken being the notable example. But since intensive farming couldn't be turned back, the answer to insipid food had to come from food scientists, and the flavour industry was born. Technological advances in the mid-1950s allowed scientists to isolate the chemicals in food that we experience as flavour. And in 1965, over 600 had been identified. But today, that number has grown to more than 2,200, and they can be combined into almost endless combinations to provide us with flavours and emotional sensations that we find desirable in food. Therefore, the food industry had to make food more palatable, and a study of goats and rats showed that they ate more when their food was sprayed with different flavours to give it a full sense of taste and variety. So the big question became, can humans be stimulated in the same way? Now, the tobacco industry certainly believes so. Cigarette companies use flavourings by the bucketful to increase desire. And now, sadly, food has followed the same model as cigarettes. Of the 145 ingredients listed in cigarettes by one company, 131 are flavours. According to an industry newsletter, flavouring makes the product sell better. The flavourings are there to act on smokers' emotions, creating feelings that seem familiar, natural and wholesome. And the result is that smokers consume more nicotine, which is the powerful addictive substance. This has now been replicated in our supermarkets. Strawberry yoghurt that contains no strawberries, only the intense flavour of the fruit, along with lots of sugar and calories. And the availabilities of foods and drinks containing flavourings has continued to rise to the point where each adult and child consumes 2 pounds of chemical deception each year. Now, 2 pounds is an enormous amount because it literally takes just a few drops of these intense chemicals to flavour an entire dish. Flavourings push our pleasure buttons, leading us to overeat and become obese. But that is only one part of the story, because intensive agriculture not only produces bland food that has to be jazzed up with extra ingredients, but the flavourless food also lacks nutrients. Flavourings and depleted nutrition go hand in hand to cause obesity and create that risk of cancer. So next week's video is going to be all about how we can start to combat the food industry with the choices we make when buying and cooking our food.